From the Folger Shakespeare Library, this is Shakespeare Unlimited. I'm Farah Kareem Cooper, the Folger Director. Does the name Richard Burbage ring a bell for you? If so, you will probably know him as a leading actor who played some of William Shakespeare's most famous roles, like Hamlet, Macbeth, Richard III, and King Lear. But when they were both alive, Richard Burbage would have been far better known than Shakespeare. Audiences swooned for his performances. The theater as a mass entertainment was still relatively new, and Burbage was one of its first proto-celebrities. Siobhan Keenan teaches Shakespeare at Montfort University in Leicester, England. Keenan has written a biography of Burbage called Richard Burbage and the Shakespearean Stage, a Delightful Proteus. Keenan's biography takes into account Burbage's popularity as an actor and his acumen as an entrepreneur. Burbage turned early modern England's theater craze into a profitable business, one that lifted Burbage's fortunes as well as Shakespeare's. Here's Barbara Bogave in conversation with Siobhan Keenan.
Siobhan, welcome to the podcast. So nice to have you here.
Yeah, delighted to be with you.
Why a book about Richard Burbage now? Have there been new discoveries?
Well, partly now because nobody had done it, and I thought it was about time somebody did. But also, I did a lot of research in the archives, looking at the world of which Richard Burbage was a part. So had lots of fun kind of reading parish registers and learning about, births and burials and marriages and thinking about who the people were around him. And I think it means we can have a much, much richer picture of the world in which Richard Burbage and his peers like Shakespeare were working. And it just felt really worth sharing that because I think it does give new insights into understanding this fantastic golden age in English theatre and the wonderful plays that we still get to enjoy from it.
Yes, and you really bring that alive by looking at the communities that shaped Burbage. Why don't you tell us about St. Stephen Parish in London, where Burbage's family lived and where he grew up?
It's a kind of small but very densely populated parish. We know that James Burbage, Richard's father, ends up living there at some point in the 1550s. He gets married there to Richard's mother. And at that point, James Burbage is a joiner. That's his kind of full-time job. But at some point while he's there, he seems to become inspired to think about acting. And by the time Richard and his siblings are coming along, Richard's father is basically, it seems, more or less full-time acting. And so, Richard's got to enter into this very interesting world of, people who are involved in the entertainment industry as well as perhaps being craftspeople by background. And we also know it seems to have been quite an interesting parish in religious terms. So a place that was gradually becoming more Puritan in the period that they were first living there. And we sometimes wonder if that's one of the reasons why James Burbage decides it's time to go elsewhere when he knows that he wants to really go into theatre full-time by building his own playhouse. And he'll end up taking the whole family off with him into St. Leonard's Shoreditch, which is another of the London parishes.
Right, so he had this carpentry background, and it makes sense he would fuse his two interests in acting and building, and he planned to build, as you say, this theater in Shoreditch. So what was Shoreditch like in the mid-16th century? We talk a lot about it in relation to Shakespeare, and it just seemed like it was one brothel after the next.
Well, it was known for having brothels and lots of kind of, inns and taverns. But I think part of its appeal for somebody like James Burbage when he moves his family there and builds the theatre is it also had kind of open space. And, if you wanted to build within the city walls of London, that was very difficult. It was very densely built, as you might expect. Whereas out in St. Leonard's Shoreditch, there's space. And one of the things that they benefit from is that dissolution of the monasteries that Henry VIII oversaw, and the fact that there's suddenly what had been church land available for you to use for other purposes. And the land on which James Burbage ends up building this theatre, it's partly what used to be, an old religious complex. So, he's making the most of the fact that there's space to build, as well as the fact that there seems to have been a kind of proto-entertainment industry already happening in St. Leonard's. Again, partly probably because it's outside the city walls and therefore beyond the immediate control of the city authorities, who tended to clamp down on things a bit more.
So he's a burgeoning impresario, I guess. What kind of businessman was he? Tough, bad, unethical? I mean, he seemed to have spent a lot of time in court.
He did, and I was about to say, probably depends who you're talking to. I mean, his reputation at the time certainly appears to have been a mixed one. Some of the most colourful stories we have about him are those, the things that end up in the court cases. And, it tends to involve him, shouting abuse at people he sees as encroaching on his business or threatening his business, and being a very robust defender of his family's theatrical interests. And so that's kind of one of the dominant images of him, a bit of a lawbreaker, fast and loose with the truth, ready to do whatever he needed to do to kind of, make his way as an impresario. He also must have had incredible charisma and an ability to win people over, because at various points in his career, he does have powerful allies. So people like the Lord Hunsdon, who becomes his patron in the 1580s. So, he must have been good at courting people. And at various points, he does win people over to put money into his business and to work with him and so on. So I think, I'd love to have met him. He sounds a wonderfully colourful character, hot-tempered, but, obviously, a guy who can win people over.
I was just going to say, I would have loved to hang out with him and have a beer. Did he come up with the idea to sell shares in a playhouse, or was that already a common practice?
Well, it's a good question, and we don't completely know the answer. It would be the honest response, but whether or not it had been done before, it does become an important model, particularly for his son Richard and the companies of which he's a part. And it's going to be one of the things that helps Burbage and Shakespeare and their company go on to have this really long-lasting career for an acting company, because they're going to be able to hold on to playing spaces where they can regularly perform in a way that many actors didn't get to do. They usually just have to rent the theatre. These guys are going to end up co-owning them.
Sure. So is it safe to assume that the father trained the son, the star of your book and the podcast, Richard Burbage, in the family business of theatre?
I think you have to assume that there was an element of training there, and that he was learning from his father, both in terms of acting and in terms of kind of theatre business. It's very possible that Richard would have had the chance to, go along and watch his father acting at the theatre or at court and various other places. He will have grown up with this all around him. So I think inevitably he was learning from James. But I think one of the things I was struck by when I was doing the research for the book is how both Richard and his brother Cuthbert seem at points to deliberately do things differently from their father once James is gone. So I think there was some other kinds of learning going on there as well. There was learning about what not to do as well as what to do.
Well, what do we know about how Richard Burbage first started acting?
What we do know is from his brother Cuthbert, he talked about Richard having acted for roughly 35 years when he finally died in 1619. And working backwards, we therefore know that he probably started acting around 1584 or 1585 when he was a teenager. But a bit like Shakespeare's so-called lost years, we don't know with whom he started acting. I guess the thing that we are probably fairly safe to assume is that he would have started his career as an apprentice player. And that would mean usually playing female roles first. So again, that's probably what he will have been doing in those early years before graduating to taking on the male parts that he would become especially famous for later on.
And the apprentices also cleaned the theater and did everything an apprentice does. And is this where the broomstick episode fits in to this story? And what was that?
So in fact, it's the very first record that we have of him, actually doing something besides being born. He's caught up in a dispute between his father and the widow of his father's old business partner, John Brain, also his aunt. Margaret Brain has turned up at the theatre demanding her share of the profits of the theatre, which she says she is owed because John Brain, co-owns it. And James Burbage, in one of his typical displays of anger and resistance, is not having a bit of it. But he's not on his own. Richard and his mother kind of also join in to basically tell Margaret that she needs to leave the theatre with her friends. And when one of those friends tries to intervene to sort of, remonstrate with him, Richard basically threatens him with his broom and says he's ready to kind of fight him outside if he wants to, which doesn't happen. But then, later on, we hear another person talking about turning up at the theatre and asking about what's happened. And Richard is kind of laughing about it. So there's also a feeling that, well, maybe Richard was just putting on a bit of a performance. And maybe this is an early example of the fact that this is a man who's going to have a talent for performing, whether that's angry, tyrannical leaders or kind of, tragic figures as he'll do later on.
Oh, I'm loving all of them right now. But how do you know about this?
Well, in that case, because it ends up in court. I mean, poor old Margaret Brain, she attempts multiple times to take the Burbages to court to try and get what she regards as her fair share of the takings of this playhouse that her husband helped build. She never seems to succeed, alas, for her. But as a result, lots of people are invited to give kind of witness statements about events that have taken place.
All historians must just thank God every night for the litigiousness of people, right?
Oh, completely. I mean, in this age, court records are probably our main source of information about what's going on in the theatre world. We're not getting people writing us wonderful reviews of productions or, really detailed accounts of, what's going on the stage. But what we do get are lots of court cases where people are disputing about who owns this or who owns that or who had a fight at the theatre and why and so on. And they're a real treasure trove of information.
So when did Burbage first intersect with Shakespeare?
Hard to be absolutely sure, but where we definitely know that they intersect is in 1594. They are both recorded as members of an acting company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men. And in fact, the first time they're associated with an acting company, both of them, is this. And they turn up their names in a court record where the two of them are paid alongside a famous clown of the day called William Kemp for a couple of performances the Chamberlain's Men had staged at court in Christmas 1594. So that's the first time we definitely know that they're together. But, it's possible that they might have overlapped before in some of these earlier acting companies of which Burbage and Shakespeare were both likely to have been members. So, there's a chance that they worked together sooner, but they're definitely working together from 1594.
And in 1594, Burbage was 26 or so. And you just mentioned Will Kemp, the great star clown. So when did Burbage become a star of the stage? Because he wasn't at that point.
No, I mean, he's an emerging figure just as Shakespeare is. And in fact, in many respects, their journey seems to have been quite a similar one. And it's going to take place, I'd say, that beginning of stardom over the next sort of 6 years. But by the time we get to the turn of the century, both Shakespeare and Burbage have started to emerge as being recognised as stars, one for writing, one for acting. Burbage, it seems that one of his probably early famous roles is Richard III. That's going to make a big splash, and we know that he's acting that by probably 1596, 1597. And by the turn of the century, you kind of know that he's become a star because you start to get allusions to him in all kinds of sources outside the theatre, including there's a wonderful university play called The Return from Parnassus, which features Burbage and Will Kemp as characters. So they come on partway through the play to audition a couple of students who are would-be actors. And it includes Burbage sort of saying, "Oh, do me a bit of Richard III." And by this point, this is in, this is academia. In academia, they expect people to know the names of Burbage and Kemp. So by that point, you kind of get that sense of this is a guy who's a celebrity in a way that we might think of today.
Okay, well, what made his Richard so popular? What made him stand out?
Well, it seems to have been, I think, the fact that he managed to combine all kinds of character in one. And here he's partly, obviously, benefiting by Shakespeare's talent, because Shakespeare creates a Richard who's a very versatile figure. It's a part that calls for the actor to play many roles in one. So, he's going to be apparently a lover with Lady Anne. He's going to be an apparently grieving brother with his brother King Edward and George Duke of Clarence. He's going to be an apparently loving uncle. He's going to be witty at various points. So the part invites somebody to show a lot of versatility. And we know from later kind of praise of Richard Burbage that this is what people really admired. He's often likened to Proteus later on, that idea of, a shape-shifting god, somebody who's brilliant at changing between different personae and doing that really quickly and suddenly and convincingly.
Just what you need to be an actor. But you also say he was known for his ability to convey strong emotions. How do we know this?
Well, again, thankfully, some people did write down what they thought about his acting. And what they tend to praise is exactly that. They talk about the versatility, but then they talk about convincing emotion. So they praise his ability to have that really, longing eye of a lover, to be convincingly riven with grief or madness. And, that seems to be what people were struck by, the fact that he could embody these emotions so convincingly so that people really thought he was feeling them. That, there's a wonderful poem written shortly after he dies where they talk about when it came to staging death, how people watching Burbage were convinced he was dying. People thought he died indeed, as opposed to simply in play, and how, again, people watching him would be almost crying and sighing with him as he played some of these, wonderful tragic heroes that he would become so famous for.
So was he more natural than the actors who were declaiming? There was still this period where acting was more about standing still and speaking clearly to the audience, just saying your lines. So was this the dawn of naturalism? It started in acting with Burbage?
It's a really good question, and there's been a lot of debate about this because I think one age's idea of what's natural is not necessarily the same as another's, but that does seem to be partly what people admired, that they thought of this as being lifelike playing. And people often turn to that moment in Hamlet where he's describing, if you like, what an ideal actor is, and suiting the word to the action and so on. And it's often been thought that what he's describing there is precisely that kind of lifelike, naturalistic acting that Burbage embodied, and that certainly Shakespeare is saying that was different from the kind of acting that had been fashionable before. But actually, when you read the descriptions of it, it's not subtle acting by the sounds of it. That praise for those really powerful emotions that he embodies and those kind of sudden changes, quick changes between different personae. It's a very passionate kind of acting. It's not necessarily restrained in the way that people would sometimes think of naturalistic acting today.
Well, his Richard III was also known for something. One of his gestures was keeping his hand on his dagger. And that seems such a small thing, but this idea of a recurring gesture or motif, was that new at the time?
Well, we don't have many accounts of it before, so I think that's perhaps why it was memorable. We don't really, before this, get many accounts of, we don't get many accounts of individual performers, but we also don't get that sense of people having signature gestures or signature moves that they might use in a performance. So again, he seems to have been doing something slightly new.
Well, you've implied that Shakespeare was perhaps thinking of Burbage when he was writing that famous passage, the rant to the players about acting. What do we know about the relationship between the two? And did Shakespeare write to Burbage's strengths, or did Burbage influence how he wrote? And I guess likewise, did Shakespeare's writing shape Burbage as an actor?
Well, most of the evidence we have is what we have in the plays, I'd say. I think you do get a real sense of it being a two-way street. So there's definitely a sense of Shakespeare seems to be writing for Burbage because he does create a number of characters that seem to include qualities for which Burbage was especially renowned. So, for instance, he does a number of characters who are, go mad in kind of spectacular ways. Characters who are very good at playing jealousy. Characters who are good at doing, again, powerful emotions. And in those early days at the Globe Theatre in the early 17th century, he creates this whole series of kind of major, really large, as in long, tragic hero parts. And most of those do seem to be written with kind of Burbage's talents in mind. But actually, I think it probably goes the other way as well, is that I think to some extent we see Burbage emerging as a star and honing those talents, that ability to be versatile, to be lifelike, to convey powerful emotions, as growing out of his work with Shakespeare, that it's Shakespeare pushing him to see what he can achieve.
And I suppose you really must see that in Hamlet, which was another one of Burbage's signature roles. Is Burbage why Hamlet was fat and scant of breath? That line that no one can understand.
Well, it's possible. I mean, if you've seen the one portrait we've got of Burbage, he does look like he might have been a stocky chap by that point, whatever he was earlier in life. But this is a really interesting example of where it does look like Shakespeare took a play that probably already existed and revised it, and probably revised it more than once.
Right. What are we going to do about Burbage? He's gained so much weight. He can't be a skinny university student.
No, and suddenly, you change some of those references to his youth in the play. So suddenly, we've got this slightly, an older figure. But again, it does look like Shakespeare was very much thinking about Burbage, because in the kind of the revised version of Hamlet that we have preserved in the second quarto, it looks like he's basically expanded some of those scenes where Burbage gets to show off his ability to do madness. So we get more scope given for his kind of being the witty clown, the antic figure, and for doing those kind of erratic speech and behaviour that Hamlet is kind of famous for. So again, I think that's very much a sign of Shakespeare coming back to a play, having worked with Burbage and thinking, we could do more with this, with you and for you.
So I want to come back to Will Kemp, because he left, he was a shareholder, and he left the company a year after they moved to the Globe in 1599. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious what impact that loss had on Burbage's career.
Well, it's an interesting question. Some people think it might have been a sign that there were tensions in the company, and that Will Kemp was very much associated with an older, more improvisatory style of acting, and that maybe Shakespeare and Burbage and other members of the company were wanting to go in a slightly different direction. And, is this about parting for artistic differences reasons? And if that's the case, then it might have been a relief for Kemp to be gone. On the other hand, Kemp was a big star. So there was also a challenge in terms of what you were going to do to replace him and to sustain this reputation that the company had grown by the time that Kemp leaves. For Burbage, it does seem to have ended up being a bit of an opportunity, in that, he was already emerging as a kind of new star, I think, before Kemp leaves. But with Kemp gone, he pretty much becomes the dominant star in the company, and the most influential figure. And it's probably no coincidence that it's shortly after this that we start to see Shakespeare writing these incredibly large roles for Burbage. So he may have felt it was an upside to Kemp's departure.
Sure. This was a new era. But while we're talking about this period, what new insights did you uncover about the role Burbage and his brother played in this infamous dismantling of the Burbage Theatre and the moving of it to the Bankside?
They've decided they need to take the timbers of the theatre and get them elsewhere, because the landlord back at the theatre is threatening to seize the property. They decide to go for a bold move. They're going to literally deconstruct it, ship it across the Thames, and rebuild it on a new piece of land that they found. The owner at that time is Cuthbert, the older brother, but Richard is right in the thick of it. The accounts that we get afterwards in the court records tell us that he's there with the various carpenters, literally dismantling the theatre just after Christmas. So, he's hands-on in terms of taking that building and taking it elsewhere. They were going to have to give their playhouse a new name. And it's a very interesting choice of name, the Globe. When their father called their theatre the theatre, it was maybe harking back to, Roman days and the notion of kind of, performance venues. But they opt for something which suggests that they had aspirations to, in some way, capture life. That's what the feeling you get with the name of the Globe is. We're here trying to represent the world. So, it's an ambitious name as well.
Yeah, it's a whole new day. Yes.
Yeah. And I think it's a sign of how confident they were at this point.
Well, so that was 1599, and by 1609, Burbage and the King's Men had two playhouses at their disposal in London, the open-air Globe and the indoor theatre Blackfriars. So in what way did this just bounty of performing spaces influence their playing or their performance styles or their choice of material?
Well, I mean, I guess one of the big impacts of having a second playhouse meant that they were in a superior position to just about every other acting company at the time. With the acquisition of the Blackfriars, they get a very different kind of space. This is a space where, yeah, you can perform when the weather's bad in the winter. You can keep going all the way through. And it's a playhouse that was known for traditionally having higher charges to get in and a slightly more elite audience. And one of the things that scholars have often kind of pondered about is whether that starts to change the way that they act their plays and the kind of plays that they perform. So, they seem to incorporate more music into the plays once they've got the Blackfriars, partly because the Blackfriars traditionally had a musical consort there. But again, interestingly, they then take that and they try to mimic it at the Globe. They start building a music room at the Globe. So there's this interesting kind of two-way traffic in terms of, there are things you could do at the indoor theatre that were harder to do at the outdoor theatre, and therefore you're going to adapt them into your plays. But equally, they had to, it seems, be very adaptable because presumably performing on the Globe stage in the open air, you were having to project a lot more as a performer versus how you might have performed when you were in the enclosed space of the Blackfriars. I'm sure they were helped by the fact that they grew out of this tradition of theatre where actually being adaptable was key to it. From the days where you would be regularly going on tour, you had to be able to perform for different audiences. You had to be able to perform in different spaces because you never knew where you were going to be.
Right. Well, so they had all this stability, but still, the King's Men and Burbage faced so much litigation. What was the deal?
Oh, my gosh. Well, I imagine it's partly a sign of how profitable theatre had become. That people knew there was money in it, and therefore people start vying to get their share of it. So some of the people who'd previously rented the Blackfriars Playhouse start trying to say, oh, we should be getting a share of the takings because the person who had the lease before you, he didn't get our permission to sell it back to you, and all these sorts of things. And I think it just tells you that people knew this was hot property. And so, all kinds of people come forward trying to argue that they've got a share in this or a share in that. But the Burbages actually managed to see them all off. So I think one of the lessons they did learn from their father, well, maybe by negative example rather than positive example, is, go through the law, do things properly, because in the end it protects you when people come for you.
Well, what effect did Shakespeare's death in 1616 have on Burbage and the King's Men?
Well, it must have been a real wrench. Shakespeare had been at the heart of the company and he'd been the resident playwright, essentially from 1594. So, nearly 20 years, he'd been at the heart of what they were doing. So I think that there was the personal loss, and I'm sure for Burbage, as somebody who'd worked so closely with Shakespeare for so long, that will have been very difficult. But there was also the professional challenge of, what do you do? How do you replace him? And I think they were lucky that they'd already started doing that. So even though Shakespeare was, their resident writer, they'd already started, a regular process of bringing in other kind of young, talented writers to produce plays for the company, and including, bringing people in to collaborate with Shakespeare. So a couple of Shakespeare's late plays are written with John Fletcher. He's one of the people that they're going to turn to step into the breach. But in another sense, Shakespeare very much stays with them after he's gone in the form of those plays. And, his plays continue to be a core part of their repertory. And certainly for Burbage, he continues to act those roles all the way up until his death. For instance, we know that there's a play performance a couple of months after Burbage dies of Pericles. Clearly Burbage was expected to be playing that role. So
yeah, he died suddenly, right? Only 3 years after Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Well, we've had a number of people point out on the podcast how amazingly big the public reaction was to Burbage's death, just this outpouring of mourning, that it seemed to even exceed the mourning for Queen Anne, who died around that time.
It was remarkable. There's much more of an outpouring of grief about Burbage's death than there is about any other performer in this period. There's nothing of the same kind when Shakespeare dies. It's more effusive than what happened when the Queen died. So, yeah, which was clearly a bit of a shock for some contemporaries.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of, Princess Di, the outpouring of grief, or Elizabeth Taylor. So you do make the argument that Burbage was, if not the first, one of the first kind of proto-celebrities.
Yeah, I would say that he is. And it's partly because of that way that his fame transcends the individual roles that he plays. So, he becomes famous as Burbage. And, when you're looking at later allusions, he's one of those people that are still talking about, 20 years after his death, he's being recalled by people who'd seen him act. We're very used to the idea, I think, of celebrities now and actors being individually or personally famous beyond their roles. But this was very new at the point that it happens to Burbage. He's not the only one. People like Will Kemp were also kind of famous, and Edward Allen. But he's definitely one of the first stars. And I guess from our point of view, probably one of the first Shakespearean stars. So especially famous for his performance of Shakespearean roles. In the way that, somebody today like Judi Dench or Ian McKellen, they're famous actors generally, but they're also particularly famous for Shakespeare.
Well, your book also drives home that he was one of the first multi-hyphenate celebrities, like Reese Witherspoon or someone, that he was so involved in the business of theater as well, given his background from his father.
Yeah, completely. And I think, one of the reasons I wanted to write about him is because I wanted to kind of tell that whole story. Because I think there's been a lot of attention to his father as the builder of the theatre, and that often been seen as one of the first playhouses. And Burbage has been known as this kind of famous actor of Shakespearean parts. But I'm not sure why, but there's been a reluctance to recognise that he was both this incredibly talented theatrical artist, but also very much a theatre businessman. Because, right, as you've said, right from the start of his career, he's in the heart of the business. And once his father dies, he and his brother, they take those playhouses over together. And, he's running those theatres right up again until the moment that he dies. He is a landlord, an owner of a theatre, as well as an artist, an actor. And I think that's one of the things that's so fascinating about him, is that he not only has this incredible impact on kind of Shakespeare and theatre acting in the period, but he also has this contribution to play in the professionalization of theatre as a business. Again, he's not alone, but he's one of those people who helps to make theatre something that can be a profession as opposed to something you just do in your part-time. And the careers that builds for a whole host of people beyond himself.
Well, thank you so much for bringing this man's period to life, if not exactly who he was, which we can never know. But you gave us so much to think about. Thank you.
Yeah, and I have to say, Barbara, I do keep thinking, if you could only find, that diary or the batch of letters where, suddenly you get, this wonderful insight into Burbage the man, or indeed Shakespeare the man. It would be so fantastic. But
I hope that for you. I hope someone finds it under a rake somewhere in a gardening shed.
It would be great, wouldn't it?
That was Siobhan Keenan, interviewed by Barbara Bogave. Richard Burbage and the Shakespearean Stage, A Delightful Proteus, is out now from the Arden Shakespeare. This episode was produced by Matt Frasica. Garland Scott is the executive producer. It was edited by Gail Kern-Pastor. We had technical help from Helen Leonard in Leicester, UK, and Voice Tracks West in Studio City, California. Our web producer is Paula Garcia Acuna. Leonor Fernandez edits our transcripts. Final mixing services provided by Clean Cuts at 3Cs Inc. If you're a fan of Shakespeare Unlimited, please spread the word. Tell a friend about why you love the podcast. Shakespeare Unlimited comes to you from the Folger Shakespeare Library. Home to the world's largest Shakespeare collection, the Folger is dedicated to advancing knowledge and the arts. If you're in Washington, D.C., come visit the Folger on Capitol Hill. Come face-to-face with a Shakespeare First Folio in our exhibition halls, or take in a play in our theater, or enjoy our Quill and Crumb Cafe. We'd love to see you. For more information, visit our website, folger.edu. Until next time, thanks for listening.